neighborhood, as well as having some experience prior to, in my internships, some rural mental health dynamics, working in New Hampshire and Vermont for 1 year and working in Yonkers for 1 year. So the other thing that I think I like to bring, a social worker with a broad base of experience, has made me think differently about telehealth as well. I kind of understand the rural part. I kind of understand working with different ages and populations, whether it's young children or adolescents or elderly. I think it's really important to remember that all of your work experience and your life experience can really inform helping people manage the remote transition. So just remember that even if you're not an expert on telehealth, and I'm certainly not an expert on telehealth, nor am I an expert on legal issues or on technology, but just relying on your own lived experience can provide so much information in terms of how to navigate this. The other thing also, of course, which is the social work way, is collaborating with the people that you're working with. How can we make this work? I'm not an expert on telehealth, so we need to really sort of figure out, how can I have a dialogue with somebody who doesn't have a great internet connection, and identify ways to find them some more resources or figure out other ways to communicate. It's really about collaborating with the people that we work with. Let me take a quick look at my notes. I'm looking down at my iPad. Okay. So thinking about just your work experience, your lived experience, providing support and information to the transition is very helpful. I've also, let's see, moving on. Okay. So the main things I'm going to touch upon are ideas around technology and equipment that I've had to adjust to over time and what I think I'm going to need going forward. I would love to hear some of the things at the end of the session that you all have added to your practices. Hearing a little voice, which is sort of fun. I'm also going to talk about sort of the clinical side of things, what has changed in terms of how I engage and communicate with people, what has been added to the work, which there's quite a few things that have been added to the work. And there's also some things that feel a little bit lacking, and we're trying to figure out how to make sense of that. There's also some ideas about the business side of things, how to collect money, how to advertise, how to connect with people, how to get referrals, that kind of thing, which feels a little bit different. How to engage with people for the first session, which is different than when somebody comes to your office. And then there's going to be some talking about boundaries and time management, which feels very different. And then finally, self-care, which is a big piece of the work. Self-care for ourselves, but also how do we make sure that we're translating all of that self-care to our patients or clients, whoever we're working with, the service users. And oftentimes social workers tend to upload a lot of that stuff to the service users or their own friends and family, but yet they don't take care of themselves in the end. Like we seem to have, think we have really big reserves, and just wanting to point out how we really need to daily remind ourselves about how to take care of our own self in order to maintain the frame of good practice with the people that we're working with. Okay. So happy to say, this all started obviously in March. I think we all have March 12th in mind, or one of those days between March 12th and 19th is the beginning of everything changing. It did feel very sudden. It was surprising. I actually have very fond memories of the client that was the last person that was in my physical space. I don't think he is aware that I hold him in my mind this way, as the last time I was sitting in my chair and there was a person on my couch. But maybe he knows unconsciously in some way that I'm holding him in that space, and hope we can meet again that way. We have been meeting consistently online, but I just think that's a memorable experience for us both to have. I think the biggest thing to think about too, thinking about the transition, is we all were thinking it was just going to be a couple of weeks. We were preparing ourselves, for 2 weeks, 3 weeks tops of a little bit of a shutdown. And I was also teaching at the time, and pretty much very quickly was able to adopt a platform. And I don't endorse any platform. I don't have any stock in any of these platforms, but I do predominantly use Zoom. I do also use FaceTime. Google Hangout, Skype. I think that's it. But I had only been a user of a participant using Zoom. I hadn't been the person who was like hosting it or organizing it. So that was sort of in the first 2 weeks, just sort of figuring out how to start a session and mute somebody and unmute somebody and all of those things that you guys all had to figure out as well. One of the things, looking back at that time, I wish I had had the wherewithal to have done a few practice runs. If anyone is just starting the telehealth process, I really recommend getting a dummy account and having some practice sessions on whatever platform you decide to use. Having two friends show up and seeing how easy it is for them to let them in the room, or transition, people to sort of pop up. How do you start a conversation when people are just arriving in that way? There's no transition into the door. There's no, oh, you hear somebody out in the waiting room and they get to walk in and sit on the couch and settle in. It's like an instant face. So it can be helpful to have some practice runs before actually having to have an initial session with a new client. Again, thinking about maintaining the frame, even though the world is very uncertain and we're managing lots of new learning skills and unfamiliarity, we want to provide as much grounding as we possibly can, grounding and consistency. And even when my dog is going to come out probably in 20 minutes and bark, I have enough experience now to know what I need to do in the moment when this session gets disrupted by an environmental outside component. So it's really helpful to be able to anticipate, having had a lot of practice before an actual experience, some of the things that could get in the way of a telehealth session. Let's see if I can move on through here. So just thinking about the first few weeks and then realizing that as the deadline getting pushed, we're going to have another month, I had to start thinking about like, okay, I think we need to get serious about what sort of tools I'm going to need. One of the things that I do want to just mention again, transition as socials. I kind of wanted to, people ask me like, how are you able to manage all this? Like you just hit the ground running and didn't miss a beat. And just a reminder that like our training prepares us for this. We are trained to be adaptable. We expect challenges. We didn't get into this profession unless we were like interested in understanding challenge and interested in problem solving, and that we're very curious and about complex dynamics and systems, and we're trying to figure out ways to do things better. I think we have innate characteristics that bring us to this profession, and then actually being in school and learning more of the skills in terms of figuring out like using different perspectives, really listening to what people are saying, being very strengths-based, identifying what's working and going with it. I think we're a little bit excited about being part of the front lines. We're expected to be, in emergency rooms. We're expected to be around after a climate crisis, or to be present during really complicated like family conflicts. So I think we're also just a reminder that like we have the like cellular data to be resilient in these moments and find the best ways to figure out how to help the people we're working with. And I think we're innately patient also. One of the things I was thinking about is I feel like I have a little muscle memory about this time because of I graduated actually in August with my MSW of August 2001. And so 2 weeks later, as I was preparing for my first job fair at the Hilton in Midtown, 9/11 happened. And I remember being like, oh gosh, how are we going to be social workers anymore in this world? And having to, in that very first moment of having an MSW for 2 weeks, realizing I just have to be adaptable. And I remember all of my resumes, which I mailed instead of emailed, I'm sure 20 years ago, were all about like, I don't know what you're needing right now. And I'm not sure, you even know what you're needing, but I'm here and available and want to be part of this process, figuring out how we're going to repair after 9/11. And I think this time feels very similar. Like we just have to approach this as saying like, I don't know what this is all going to look like, but I'm here and available to help figure it out. So again, just sort of thinking about your abilities in terms of being part of a life-altering, life-changing moment in terms of how we deliver healthcare. Okay, and so now we're going to stay on this for a little bit. Just thinking, shifting of practice, primarily in terms of equipment. So when it first happened, I had all the equipment that I needed. I had, luckily, a computer that was maybe 2 or 3 years old, fairly hardy. I had pretty solid internet service, and I had headphones, like probably the same ones that I have right now. And that definitely carried me through for the first few weeks. I probably was Zooming or on some type of platform, maybe 10 hours a day. It felt very sudden. People were really reaching out. There was a lot of added sessions as people were trying to navigate all of the new news. And I was teaching as well, so that some of that Zoom time was for teaching. But one of the things I did need to do, and I don't know if other people are aware of this or have considered this, but I did need to get faster internet service, and was quite surprised to find out that I had like the lowest amount of internet service, like speed, and that it was quite easy just through a phone call to have my speed doubled for no extra charge. I was like totally underusing my internet bit speed, which is also a new term I didn't know anything about, but you really probably have between 10 and 20 megabits speed. There are ways you can download a program to test your speed, or your internet provider can also test your speed for you and tell you where you're at. Okay, we're getting a little message here. I hope everyone can hear me. I just got a notification of internet instability. The other thing to think about, particularly around internet speed too, obviously, again, maximizing the amount that you need, and just identifying how many other people in your house are using it. So if you have somebody else, if you have students at home, if your partner's online video conferencing all day too, if you have a big gaming person in your family, you definitely need between 20 and 30. So just think about that as a way to make your life a lot easier. I'm also realizing now, as everyone's gone back to work and we have a lot more students back to school this September, I do think that we're going to have some instability in the internet, and we have to be prepared. So if you can preemptively up your speed and get all of your systems in line, check your routers, all of those things, you're going to save yourself some complicated troubles. Okay. So in the beginning, the basics were just fine. I think 4 or 5 months into it, I have a wish list of things that I really want for equipment and technology. And probably the number one thing that would help me in this moment is a standing desk. Again, we'll get back to self-care at some point, but just the sitting is the new form of like cigarette smoking in terms of like how bad it is for our body. And not only was it bad sitting in a comfy therapist chair hour after hour, but this sort of way of sitting in front of a screen with our chin forward and we're listening, paying attention, and barely moving is really detrimental to our health over the long term. And so my wish list at the moment, and maybe the next time I ever speak to you all, I will have a standing desk and just be able to, after every session, be able to use different chairs or be standing, being at different heights, and just incorporating that sort of movement. Other technology that I would like to have on a wish list is different headphones. I see that some of you are wise enough to have those over-the-ear headphones, those sort of Princess Leia look, which I think is much better for your ears over time and your health. Even if whatever we kid each other a little bit about, like being airplane controllers or those kinds of things, it's just you have to be comfortable, and I think having these things inside your space can be a little intrusive. Another piece of equipment that would be helpful is an additional monitor or device, particularly in practice. I'm not a big note taker in practice, in session when I'm with a client, but it's much easier to be able to turn my head this way and take some notes and then look back at the person. They know I'm in that moment writing down the medication that they're on or their psychiatrist's name, and it's specific. Whereas if I'm kind of looking at them and typing, it's just a little bit more of a disconnect. It's like, what are they doing? What is she doing? It just feels a little bit more like deliberate, like I'm moving away, writing down something important about you, and now I'm back to you, instead of multitasking that. So different monitor would be helpful, or different keyboard. At the moment, I do have an iPad that I can look at notes on instead of, again, sharing the screen. And a good chair always, but I've been seeking a good chair for 20 years. I still have not been able to find the perfect chair for a 5'1", like little person, that where my feet can still touch the ground and my back can hit the backrest. I have not seen a chair like that. Okay. See if I'm missing any of my wish list. New technology. Okay. Okay. I talked about, like, if you're starting on a new platform, I'm not going to be totally the most useful person about understanding how the HIPAA compliance regulations have been relaxed since the beginning of COVID. But what I am aware of as a layperson is that every 90 days there has been an extension from the Health and Human Services department that has been relaxing the regulations so that we're allowed to use some of these platforms that prior to COVID we were not allowed to use. Like, you weren't actually Skype was not HIPAA compliant. Zoom was not HIPAA compliant unless you added some other layers that often cost a lot of money, actually. And they did not want people to have interrupted service, and have relaxed those regulations. So you won't get in trouble for using FaceTime or Zoom or Google Hangouts in order to have a session. We do need to pay attention for when that changes. I think in New York State, it's going to be renewed in October again, but it's good to sort of follow up and make sure that we are aware when that changes, so we're not at risk of, being out of regulation. And I would also suggest that people just sort of pay attention. There is some legislation that's been introduced that wants to make this a permanent situation for telehealth. And, there's particularly a lot of, like, social justice dynamics around this, people who live in rural areas who haven't been able to have access to healthcare, particularly mental health. This would be a way to really sort of shift that forever, to make this a standard practice, so we can access more people. So also, when thinking about if you're going to go into a telehealth practice, you just need to be aware of what platforms will be the most HIPAA compliant if they are going to go back to some of those regulations. Again, I'm speculating, but I'm sure many of these platforms are scrambling to make sure that when those regulations get put back in place, that they're going to be HIPAA compliant, particularly Zoom, which seems to have really absorbed the majority of the telehealth folks. But also, at the end of this, please, if anyone has more information about that, would love to hear other perspectives. Okay, so that's where I'm at for technology in terms of the equipment that's helped me with telehealth. I'm going to move a little bit into time management and boundaries. Again, I would love to practice what I preach here. I'm hoping this webinar will put in some time boundaries for myself. It's very easy to work a lot, partly because we're home, partly because we feel like we're providing a service when people are feeling really stressed out, and we want to be something that's available to them when they're being deprived of so many other things. I also probably have some survivor guilt in terms of that I have been working solidly since the beginning of this. When I see people around me who've lost their jobs, who are very, very stressed economically, who feel very worried, and I want to be available to those people because I've been working solidly since the beginning of this. But with that said, and certainly, like, the New York Times, there's been articles about this, our weekends are sort of turning into no more weekends. We're working on Saturdays. We're working at 10 o'clock at night. It's not unheard of to see an email from somebody, at 5:30 in the morning. And we just are responding. We're sort of co-creating this dynamic of being available all the time, which obviously is not sustainable and not healthy. clinically, I have my clinical lens on too, and I know that probably for myself and some other people, it's easier to work than to think about some of the things that are going on. But when we take time off, the reality sinks in of some of the terrible health outcomes that have happened because of COVID. We have to identify some of the scary climate things that are going on, political things that are going on, social justice dynamics that have been, failing large communities of people for hundreds of years. But it's easier to stay connected to the work if we have it than to contend with all of these very dark, big dynamics. So it's also about like taking a clinical lens to say like, well, are we avoiding something by working all the time too? Do we need to actually sit with these feelings and figure out how this has impacted me, my community, my family, the world? So just be mindful of how you're scheduling your time. I'm very good at advising patients and clients down and have a schedule where you're actually identifying when you're going to have lunch, when you're going to have a nap, when you're going to binge watch, I don't know, Gilmore Girls, whatever the show is at the moment that feels like those were the best times ever. Schedule that in. So at the end of the day, you can say, oh, I actually did work my 7 hours, my 6 hours, my 4 hours, but I also did, have lunch with my friends. I took the dog for a walk. I did my laundry. I binge watched, because we're also losing like how we're being productive. I don't know if anyone else has had that feeling of like, what have I been doing for the last 5 hours? To have actually some concrete information about what you're going to do today. And then at the end of the day, that's what I did today. Okay, good. Let's get on to tomorrow. But particularly about making sure you're not over scheduling yourself and being the healer. The other thing I'm thinking about in terms of time, in private practice at least, I've been interested in not holding to I do a 50-minute session with most folks, sometimes a 45-minute session, but I have been open to playing around with the time a bit and having 30-minute sessions. Part of this was prompted by just really hearing a lot of information about how the Zoom experience and screen time is not as healthy, even though they're having a telehealth session. So it's want to contribute to fatigue and their nutrition and all of the other health issues that we're finding happen when somebody's sitting in front of a screen all the time. So I have introduced like, how do you feel about, we'll prorate the session. Let's do it for 30 minutes. Does that make more sense? Also for people who are sitting in front of their screen, chatting with their office people all day long, and then just clicking a button, moving right on to me, I'm really asking people, if they don't have the time to do that, for us to have a shorter session so they can turn off their computer for 5 minutes, go get a glass of water, go look out the window, mentally prepare themselves for a session, instead of just clicking from one to the other. It's just that 5 minutes of just sort of consolidating and transitioning. It's probably one of the biggest things that I miss about people having to commute to my office is that they had 15 minutes on the subway to just really think about, what am I doing? What do I want to get out of this? What am I working towards? And also leaving behind whatever their office dynamics were, or leaving behind whatever their family stuff was, mentally preparing. And I want to maintain that frame too. And if they don't do that because they only have 45 minutes for this session, then we have to shorten the session so they can have that time. I also really, at the end of sessions, ask people, what are you doing in the next 15 minutes? How are you transitioning out of our time together? What do you need to prepare yourself to like shift back onto that call with, your client? But part of that is just being a little bit more fluid with time and a little bit more loose. So taking care of time for ourselves and also modeling time for our patients. Very helpful. Let's see if I covered all of my time thoughts. Okay. Yeah, the other thing that I do have found has been happening, and I co-created it in the beginning. The first couple of months, people needed to shift their times all the time. They couldn't have childcare. There were too many people in the house. They couldn't meet. Can we do this later? I was super accommodating. And I definitely have firmed that up in the last month or two, just reminding people we need to pick a time. It has to be at the same time every week as best we can. How can we make it so you're always doing a session when your partner's in the park with the kids, so you know that you have that dedicated time and you're not seeking, not sitting in your bathroom or in the closet like people are often doing, but just having a little bit more psychological privacy. So helping people stick to schedules that way is also about sort of keeping that frame. And then transitioning a little bit into one more point, I guess, to add about when I'm constantly accommodating people's shifting schedules, I'm certainly empathic to their needs, but it often always bites me in the butt. I often double book. I make mistakes. They make mistakes. We have different times. They haven't updated their Google Calendar. Even if it sounds like we're being rigid or not accommodating, in the long run, it makes for much more consistent sessions and their time gets more productively. Okay. In terms of boundaries, obviously boundaries have shifted quite a bit. Boundaries have shifted in just in terms of people know my spaces. I work from multiple spaces. And I definitely was very forthcoming in the beginning. People were worried about each other, right? And they're allowed to be worried about their therapist because I'm in the same pandemic that they are in. I'm having the same scary news on all the time, wondering what's going to happen. So one of the boundaries that shifted is people wanted to know, like, where are you? And I would often reveal I'm in my office, or I'm in my living room, or they've noticed my background change. I'm in Vermont. I'm in New York City. And that needed to happen because they needed to have a sense of like where I was, which prior to COVID, if I had been doing a telehealth session, number one, I don't know if it would come up as much. And if it did, I probably wouldn't answer it as directly. I might wonder, like, what are you curious about? What do you need to know? Reflecting back, what is their fantasy about where I'm at or what I'm doing before answering? I often do gratify as a clinical technique, but usually not so quickly. But instead I'd say like, oh yeah, I'm here. I'm closer to my family. Or I'm back in New York City. I feel good here in New York City. So that was a boundary difference that maybe I should be paying attention to it. I don't think people are needing that as much to check in, although people are very aware of my background changes. And they are kind of what's going on. Clearly, the other boundary dynamics are just, I feel it's a double-edged sword to live alone. I think certainly for work purposes, it's been tremendously helpful and useful when I talk to my colleagues and friends who have lots of people to share a space with in a small New York City apartment. It's really overwhelming and daunting, obviously. I'm sure many of you are experiencing it. So I don't have as many environmental interruptions, but that doesn't mean I still don't have lots. Particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, my buzzer would buzz 10 times a day because everyone was getting deliveries in my building. And of course, they're just buzzing every single person's buzzer. So every session I would be jumping up to like go buzz the buzzer so somebody could get in. Outside noises. My neighborhood is pretty festive musically, and it's going on all of the time at all hours of the day. Lots of honking, lots of beeping, buzzing, and then I do have a dog that I have shared, and I've been very quiet and cooperative for this last 45 minutes. He's going to get a big cookie after this. But people wondering like, oh my God, I didn't know you had a dog, and having lots of feelings about that. Sometimes they would want to see the dog. I'd have to introduce the dog. Or sometimes the dog would sort of photobomb me in the background. So those kind of things that I think in the long run have been, with the exception of one or two people who really don't want to know about my life in that way at all. It's not helpful to them. The majority of people, I think, feel connected. I'm another human. I have to put up with some of the same things that they're putting up with. Some people obviously had lots of curiosity about, sort of what color my walls would be. And it's a lot of grist for the mill in terms of our clinical work and our relational work about being able to see some of those things. So in that sense, some of the boundary differences feel good. And some of them I'm getting a little weary of. I actually, just before starting this webinar, I'm in a very rural place. It's like the quietest place you could possibly imagine. And basically 5 minutes before this started, like a huge logging truck parked basically outside my door and unloaded like a wood chopping thing. And I was like panicked that be some tree felling during this webinar, which is not the case either. Thinking about, another thing about some boundary dynamics is people wanting to share information. Like, again, in the past, they'd want to know if they knew I was in New York City and they were out somewhere else. How's the city? How does it feel? What's it like? Should I come back? Why are you there? Shouldn't you be leaving? Like a lot more, very personal, where I had to sort of declare some of my values or some of my interests, not fully, but in just ways to contain them a little bit, like saying, I'm fine. I'm very happy being in New York City. I have my little bubble. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And then letting them have feelings about that, like thinking that I was being reckless or not really taking care of myself. And then similarly, if they saw me being in a more rural place, I think some feelings coming up about like, oh, wow, lucky her. So it sounds like she's able to get out. And then being able to talk about some of those feelings and dynamics. The other thing, obviously, besides the COVID dynamic and being on lockdown, were the protests happening and some of the other information that needed to get shared around that. My office is downtown. Some of the storefronts were sort of hardest hit, and there were sort of many of the marches that felt unproductive in some ways. And people really needing to know, how's your office doing? Like very concerned and worried about that area of town and what did I know about it? And me having to convey, like sort of like being, providing news for them. That felt very different. Okay. So moving on, engagement. What did I say here? Yeah, how I'm engaging with clients. So there's lots of, in some ways it kind of feels the same, I have to say. Again, maybe because I've been doing this now for 5 or 6 months, I was like, is anything different? And I had to really rack my brain to be like, of course things are different. But some of their dynamics remain the same despite like a global health scare. They're still sort of, working through some of the same issues that brought them into treatment in the beginning. How I engage with them is a little bit different, though. I'm a little bit more directive, particularly around how they need to come to the sessions. And again, in the beginning, I was super accommodating, flexible. Now I'm much more direct about that they need to do their best to get a dedicated space, that they can't be walking with me outside, like with their phone. And I'm like trying to like listen to them while the wind is blowing and the camera's moving. I totally understand if they don't have private space, but we have to figure out a different way because I can't concentrate. I can't hear what they're saying. There are probably like 5 different versions of watching somebody on a screen that makes me nauseous. If somebody has a fan going on over their head that's in the screen, I realize about 5 minutes into that, I'm feeling a little woozy. It took me a while to figure out like, oh yeah, you have to move your camera so I don't see that spinning fan. Another thing that can be a sort of a very uncomfortable experience is a huge bright light right above their head, or if they're backlit by really bright windows so you can barely see their face. So many dynamics that I wouldn't have thought of, that I didn't want to interrupt the session to say like, can you make me a little more comfortable? But what I realized is that I couldn't concentrate properly. And most people, feel like it wasn't even on their radar that there was a fan above them spinning. They didn't see it in their own screen. It wouldn't have occurred to them that was something that was really interrupting. So being much more directive about If they can wear headphones, that's super helpful. Having the dedicated space. If they have to be outside, which I completely understand with crowded conditions, then I ask if we can do a phone session as opposed to a video session. So they can be, first of all, aware of their surroundings more. Instead of staring at me, I want them to be aware of confidentiality. I want them to be, seeing what's happening on, if they're sitting on a park bench, are people coming closer to them? Is there something happening that they need to get out of the way of? Just feels a little dangerous for them to be walking and talking. And I want to feel more relaxed while I listen to what they're saying. So phone sessions are often the way to go when somebody has to be outside. If someone is lucky enough to have access to a car, I also tell people, go to your car. If your house is too crowded, the car is the best, most private cocoon. Again, as long as it's not like crazy hot and as long as it's not way too cold. There's a few months that the car is the perfect place to have a session. What else am I directive about? Really reminding them about confidentiality for themselves. A lot of times people will start a session and I'll always say like, do you have a private space? Just to remind them, because I think people think that they're in a private space, but then all of a sudden, there's, and private spaces are sometimes in the bathroom, sometimes in a walk-in closet, or not even a walk-in closet. But what happens is they think they're in a private space and they can talk about the weather with me at normal volume. But the second they want to talk about their sex life, they're whispering and they're not sure if they're allowed to say this. And then I say like, okay, we're not really in a private space. So just uploading again, just sort of what does confidentiality mean for them? How can we make sure that they can transition from talking about one thing to talking about something that's maybe more emotionally informed and not feeling that they have to edit themselves. And so people do get that. And sometimes we also have to say like, let's not go there. Like, I know your 4-year-old is going to be popping in at a moment because she's so curious about what you're doing in this other room, and we're not going to, it's hard to contain her. So we're going to talk about some other things. We're going to talk about maybe some self-care this week. We're going to talk about some things that don't feel like, I wouldn't want her to open up something that then has to get like squashed because there's too much environmental intrusion. The other thing that will happen too is particularly people working with kids, if kids keep coming in the room because they're curious, particularly certain ages that, they don't quite understand why mommy needs this separate time, I invite them in and I talk to the parent also to say like, when they come in, like, we don't want to always be like shushing them or telling them to go away. It's like they can come in, they can meet me. I have one client who refers to me as Nicole Boyd time, like it's one word, Nicole Boyd time. And this little person will come in and be like, are you in Nicole Boyd time? And be able to take a look at me and see that I'm this thing and I can wave, and that soothes her curiosity. And then she can exit the room and go play with siblings or go play with my client's partner. But just being flexible around that has been helpful. And it's also like a wonderful gift to be able to see some of my clients' children or animals or spaces. It's really made me connect to my clients in a different way that feels more human and real. Okay. Engaging with clients. So I think I shared that I will shift the time around. I don't have to stick to the 45 minutes. I may also do longer sessions if I feel like I can't see somebody more like than once a week, but I can tell that they need more time. I'm more open to doing an hour session. Sometimes I'll do an hour and 15. Let's see what else I can add here about engaging. Yeah, so environmental things that make it hard for me to concentrate that I need to tell them to work on. There are definitely some things that I struggle still. Again, this is where I could use any ideas or just want to think a little bit about, while I'm able to say that light's too bright or that fan's going too fast or you're jostling the device, I have a hard time. Some people really want to talk right on, And I think that's a privacy issue, and I understand that there's a little bit of a clinical thing, but it really fills my ears, and I'm struggling with figuring out how not to micromanage how people are trying to discommunicate, but also realize that there can be some discomfort that goes along with it. There's another person who is always stirring her tea, and she doesn't realize that it's right next to the microphone. So she's talking, but like basically all I'm hearing is like the tea stirring. So there's, you know, sort of a never-ending set of environmental intrusions where, you know, I have to make a balance of like what I'm gonna try to control and what I cannot control. I think probably the most frustrating aspect of some of the video sessions is when one of us has a poor connection, and we try to muddle through even though we're losing connectivity. I can't hear what they're saying. You know, we've all had that experience of being frozen in like one of our most like unsightly grimaces. But trying to keep my concentration while we're having like that pixelated poor connectivity experience is really challenging. And I know for some of my clients, they have no room, right? Either they're in a community where they can't get better connection. Similarly, if they're on a cell phone because they have to get a more private time, cell phone connection can also be very choppy and spotty. And it's just about being super patient with the technology, with ourselves, and with our clients who are just trying to like have some sense of connection. Very occasionally, I will, when we've had a very choppy session, I will just send an email sharing sort of the things that I got from the session and like what I'm looking forward to speaking about next session, just so I can reflect back to them that I got some of the things they were talking about. Because sometimes, you know, these can end prematurely. They can feel very disconnected at times. And I just want them to know, I heard most of what you're saying and we're going to get back to it. So that's something that I wouldn't have done in the past, would have any of that sort of outside contact after a session. Okay. The other thing I do about helping families find more privacy is also their partners to wear headphones while they're in a session. So they may be in a session in a bedroom and they're working out in the kitchen, but asking them to still wear headphones and be listening to music, or to add just another layer, and just have respect for that time. Or even be doing something super different, like they're on a treadmill, right? Like it's hard to overhear your partner's session if you're on a treadmill listening to like Tribe Called Quest or something. Let's see. Okay. I guess I can think a little bit about, well, I'm not working with young children at the moment. I see the youngest I have at the moment is a 17-year-old. He's all about talk therapy. So I don't have to add any other sort of tools or dynamics. I do see couples, and the majority of the couples end up sharing one screen as opposed to being on two different screens. In the beginning, I asked people what they wanted to do, if they needed to feel like they had their own like sort of separate screen. Most people opted to sit like on a couch together looking at me. Oftentimes they both migrate off the screen, and I have to do a little bit of corralling and remind people to always have their view on landscape when you're doing couples work or family work, because you have a much broader screenshot of them. If they're on portrait, then you don't see either couple. Sometimes couples have been in different states, and then we just obviously have to use different screens. Similarly, as helping individuals to prep for the beginning and the end of a session, I really tell couples, what are you going to do after the session? Do you need 15 minutes, like not talking about anything? Do you need to just go make dinner? Do you want to say right now that you're going to stop this conversation that feels upsetting? Or do you want to continue working on some of the positive things that you came up with during the session? But I'm much more direct about how do you want to use your time as you transition out of this together, particularly if they're in high conflict. And then I have a few colleagues who do groups, and my sense is that the groups have been going strong, partly because people have really needed the community of groups, and people really projected that there would be a drop off, thinking that people wouldn't want to meet this way, or it's too confusing, who's going to talk when, you can't see body language. But my colleagues say that their groups are super strong right now, that people just want to have that contact with other humans in isolation. So I can't speak to that specifically, but my friends have shared some. And people working with children, I think, have gotten super creative. Again, social workers just really share resources with each other and come up with great ways of keeping little people engaged, even on screen. One of the things that I think has happened is there's a lot more parent involvement, which can only benefit the child as well, to have parents in the session and doing playful things with their child during the session. So I think that's actually a positive. Also getting other family members involved, instead of, again, a dedicated session, maybe for play therapy for someone who's 5 or 6, incredibly beneficial, but here's a real opportunity to engage the family in ways that sometimes is harder in office, right? Everyone has busy schedules. Very hard to do family work, getting everybody together in an office for an hour, whereas much easier to do at home. So my colleagues seem to be enjoying some of the family work and the child work with the remote platform. And they use all sorts of other contraptions too in technology. You can get whiteboards for drawing. They have like interactive game playing. I'm sure we've all been on a Zoom call where we're playing Pictionary with our loved ones. Like, all of that's happening in play therapy too. So just thinking about those applying to group and couples and play therapy. Okay. I feel pretty lucky in that I haven't had a crisis. No one has needed to be hospitalized, and no one has hospitalized for any sort of psychiatric condition, nor has anyone been hospitalized for a COVID-related illness. So I feel incredibly lucky that I haven't had to navigate that. I do have a few patients who definitely feel a little bit more suicidal ideation. They're very isolated. It's clearly, they feel pretty bleak thinking about like how we're going to get through the next few months. And I have stepped up my insistence that they're in contact with a psychiatrist and that I have access to that psychiatrist. In the past, I would not necessarily need to have like all that information right away. But when somebody expresses anything like that, even passive suicidal ideation, I am very quick to say, like, in order to continue working, I really need to know, you need to let me know by the end of the week that you have an appointment with a psychiatrist or your primary care or a nurse practitioner. And then we're going to follow up on that. And then I'm going to have their information and they're going to have mine. So that may be just sort of one change that I've implemented, is just needing to feel like I'm more part of a team as opposed to an individual therapist. Okay. In terms of business stuff, again, I'm super lucky that I have seen no change in my volume of work. In fact, I have more work, and part of that is because I have a little bit more time. I'm obviously not commuting myself. I have more time to be scheduling people. And of course, the downside of that is I'm overscheduling people, but I've already covered that and I'm going to work on that. In the beginning, I also reached out to a number of former clients just to check in and say, I hope people are doing well. We're all in this together. I'm here. I'm holding sessions. Again, not as I didn't really want any more people to sign up, but it was just a way to say, like, I'm thinking about you all. You're part of my experiences in my New York life, and I'm here. And whether that has actually led to some people probably referring people to me, or I just popped in their mind again, or maybe they would have 1 or 2 sessions just to say, like, hey, can we check in and let's catch up and like make sense of this craziness. but I don't normally have outreach to former clients that way or former patients that way. And it actually felt like a positive thing to do. And most people really appreciated hearing that, like, you know, glad to hear that you're okay, and that you're available if I ever need something down the line. It also led to just, again, being more human. People would give me little updates. You know, one of the hard parts about being a therapist is when someone graduates or moves on to other things, we don't always know the end of the story. And so it's really fun when somebody gives you a little update and says, you know, I got that job, or I moved, or I had a baby. It's nice. So that kind of outreach led to some of those little moments. Obviously, I can see more people who are not in New York, which expands my client base and has led to also, and again, we'll see what this all looks like in a few months if we switch back to the HIPAA compliant regulations for seeing people across state lines. It's really expanded my client base. People are asking me if, you know, they can work with me, and they are in Florida, they're in Georgia. I am not taking on new clients like from different states because I think that's going to be complicated. But it was kind of exciting to see, like, oh, I can be generating, there's a whole other pool of people out there if I ever do want to expand my practice in that way. Okay. I have fewer expenses. I am happily and sadly holding on to my office space. So it's a little sad that I'm paying rent and not using that space, although I do go there every once in a while. I have negotiated my rent down, though, so I'm saving money on my rent. I don't have internet service there. I don't have water service or utilities, so I'm actually saving money because of this. And we'll see what happens, obviously, with real estate in New York City going forward, if we're going to see a tremendous decrease in commercial rents. Obviously, this is a big question going forward, if what telehealth is going to do to office work in general. But there's going to be a lot of, I think, movement around that in a good way, that things are going to be a little bit more affordable, which we desperately need, both in housing rent and in commercial rents. What else in terms of business aspects? Yeah, I guess many of my colleagues have given up their space, I should say, too. And obviously that saves tremendous amount of money if you're, you know, just self-employed. The other thing I've noticed is I've had to tighten up some of my protocols, which were long overdue. I can be a little loose in terms of just my paperwork, in terms of managing my databases of client information, updating all of their information, whether it's addresses and insurance info, or, you know, just even their current address. I've definitely locked down on some of that stuff. Just said, like, okay, I really need to have a handle on all of my things, since I don't have an office to go to and sort of flip through old files to find paperwork. I've gotten some much better at setting up some systems that I think are going to be better for me in the long run. It's also brought me into the 21st century in terms of exploring electronic medical systems. I have been a paper person. I was going to say in the beginning of this, it's funny, I'm talking about telehealth best practice because I'm somebody who would, you know, still uses a day minder with a pencil. I prefer books over e-readers. Yeah, I am a little bit of an old-fashioned person, and I think this is definitely the push of, you know, being on an electric medical system is so much more efficient and so much more containing and practical. And I have been exploring some of those. There are millions out there. Again, I don't have an endorsement for any single one, but it's helping me join the future. Similarly with teaching, I have to say the remote online teaching has, you know, just stepped up my game in terms of being a more interactive teacher and using, you know, things like Padlet and whatever, Flipchart. And I would have really reluctantly gone into that if I hadn't been pushed off the diving board. I guess lastly, more people are paying directly, like through electronic payments. In the beginning, I didn't have a set system. Again, I was preferring checks. mailed to my office, which is still happening. But most people transfer to all sorts of different electronic banking things. So the money gets directly deposited to me very quickly, which is pretty exciting. And my only regret is that I should have picked like one or two primary systems. I have, money coming through Venmo and PayPal and Zelle and all of these different things. And I'm sure my accountant will let me know at the end of this year, like, wow, you should have just, picked a lane just for accounting purposes. So I would recommend that if you're about to start this process, pick a payment lane. One of the things I have been thinking about too, a lot of people would like to pay with a credit card, and I've always had feelings about credit cards. Again, that might be a little bit old-fashioned. I could open my mind to them because a lot of people like using cards to get points, and they're using it as a reward system, whereas I came from the mindset that like if someone's using a credit card to pay for therapy and it gets out of control, or they lose their job, or they're not, I don't want to contribute to a stressful dynamic if they run up a really big tally on their credit card. But I'm re-looking at that a bit. And it may be something that I end up taking on. I do think they also charge fees though, which I am opposed to. Okay. I think that's about it in terms of my business shifts and changes and things to be thinking about. I think the last thing I wanted to cover, flexibility about the future really, is just being ready for anything. I don't know if I'm going to go back to my office. I don't know if my building will still offer me an office. I think that they lost almost 80% of their tenants. And I'm sure they're trying to figure out how to be viable. So I'm just sort of going month by month and letting my patients know when they ask, are you going to be back in the office? I say, I hope to be, and let's see what happens after January. And I think we're all in the same boat this way, just not knowing what's going to happen and sort of tolerating that uncertainty. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Again, I shared a lot of ways of how I'm modeling or how I'm helping people get the most out of the sessions for telehealth remote, and really just, again, providing much more guidance and education about how they can make the best use of their time, being as flexible as I can with the dynamics that they're in, and helping them be flexible with themselves, maintaining consistency, trying to have a similar background as much as possible, or at least they know they have 2 or 3 they have to contend with, modeling being adaptable, being as clear in my communication as I can with them, because again, they're not getting that from clearly a lot of our institutions and government and external world. We don't get a lot of clear communication. So I'm just trying to do that as best I can, help them with that. Okay. And then really, really honing in about self-care, starting with ourselves. Obviously, just a reminder, we are all experiencing a really stressful, crazy time. And we are not immune to the chaos that's going on. We're not immune to obviously getting sick. We're not immune to our family members being at great risk, just economic worry, just all of the stresses. And we have to wake up every day knowing we're in the helping profession, and we want to model, adaptability, flexibility, consistency, groundedness, but we have to figure out ways to make sure we have that for ourselves and be really generous. I really, really recommend having lots of supportive supervision with your colleagues, whether you have a supervision group or it's informal peer-related group. Our friends and family, sometimes think we're totally wackadoodle for being in this profession in the first place, because we are agreeing to work in like the most challenging conditions with some people in tremendous pain. So sometimes people are like, of course, you're having a bad day because this is what you do every day. So getting that support from our colleagues who know that sometimes it feels even worse than usual, and that they really get that most of the time we can monitor some of the really traumatic experiences that people share with us. And then sometimes we feel like, our membrane is just much thinner. So talking to colleagues, super helpful. And spending lots of time with friends and family, and not being our social worker selves, where we're allowed to be bossy and directive and maybe use humor, or even say like, I don't want to hear this right now. We have to have opportunities to do that. We don't have that opportunity when we're working with our patients and our clients. Yeah, obviously doing things that you enjoy, remembering the things that you enjoy. A lot of us are feeling like we can't remember what we enjoy, or some of the things that we've enjoyed we're deprived of, right? Maybe we can't go to the gym anymore. Maybe we can't go to our favorite cafe and people watch to take a break, but we have to figure out, like, I do really like puzzles. I really like cooking. I like standing. Cooking is a really great way to stand if you've been sitting all day. Those kind of things. Biggest piece of advice I have is to move between sessions. You have to carve out dedicated time to move. And the move has to be like, again, like you are laying on the floor doing like your 5 favorite yoga stretches. You are doing 15 jumping jacks. You are going up and down. I live on a 3rd floor walk up. I'm going up and down those stairs 3 times and just getting my heart rate up and moving my legs differently. We really need to think about circulation. We need to think about spine health, neck pain, all of those things. Full disclosure, I often do 2 sessions in a row and then try to take a half-hour break. But if you can start your practice always having a 15-minute break between sessions and getting up and moving, your body will be so grateful to you in 10 years. One of the things I have found that's helpful from home is I can do a quick chore sometimes between sessions. So my laundry happens to be in the basement of my building. So I'll use that. I'll run downstairs, change the laundry, run back upstairs, get on another call. I'm noticing I could do this right now. Thinking about your screen, just thinking about eye health and Zoom fatigue. Right now I'm going to do it. I forgot to do it already. Turn down the brightness on your monitor. Most of the time we are looking at a monitor that is way too bright, very unhealthy for our eyes. And we just forget it's just so simple to turn it down to barely anything, and you're still visible to the people who you're working with. Obviously, get a comfortable chair, have good lighting. Take the time to prepare for your sessions. That's the other thing. If I know I'm going to see 5 people throughout the day, I set up my little station. Even if I'm getting up in between, I make sure all of my devices are charged. We forget sometimes that our computer hasn't been plugged in, and all of a sudden halfway through the session, you're down to 1%. Make sure everything's charged. Make sure all your other devices are turned off so you don't have those interruptions. In Vermont, I have a landline, and who knew that the landline was ringing 10 times a day between 9 and 5 when I wasn't up here all the time. I have turned the landline ringer off permanently because I was getting so many like firemen calls and political calls and people speaking in foreign languages robocalling me. But just to remember that there's all those sort of like pings and chimes to think about that you don't want interrupting the flow of a good session. Let's see, have a glass of water nearby. I'm drinking a lot more water because I'm allowing myself to drink water in session or right in between session, but just keep yourself super hydrated. I keep my reading glasses nearby. I have my water. I have my lipstick right nearby in case I need to perk up quickly in between a session. Your appointment book, a pad of paper, a pen, and then did I mention water to take care of yourself. And we need to remind our clients of all of these same things that we're doing for ourselves, just to make sure that they are doing all the same things that we hopefully are modeling for them, checking in. Sometimes, we can throw all this great news out there and a week later we're all back to our old habits. And I'm the number one culprit of that, of forgetting my new intention of the moving between sessions. Okay. What else? I guess I can share. I think we might be close to some questions maybe, but people are curious about like sort of what the future is. You know, again, I don't have a crystal ball. Certainly the news is suggesting that telehealth is here to stay. I think my clients certainly reflect that back to me. Maybe 10% are chomping at the bit to get back into the office. They really like that separate space. They like having, they feel connected to my office. Some people I've worked with for, 5 years. And, they remember my couch. They know the painting that's behind me. They feel connected to my doorman in that building, actually. He's actually part of the session half the time. Because he's such a welcoming presence when they come into the door of this building. But my hope, I think, is a hybrid model where we're able to be in the office, even if it's 1 week a month or 2 days a week or some version of it. And the telehealth piece can stay in place for those who need it. Again, if you're working with people who are chronically ill, who have childcare issues, have transportation issues, riding the train is expensive. It's a huge bonus for people to be able to have this as a way of getting the help that they need from someone that they're comfortable with. One of the concerns I do have, though, is, again, how will we ever terminate with people if we can go online forever? It's a big question. Termination is such a huge part of social work. And we need to be mindful of endings and graduations and helping people transition, or even finding, new helpers. Maybe I've done as much work as I can and they should be working with somebody who's thinking more along the lines of EMDR or another modality that can be another set of tools for them. I think we might get caught, and I'm going to continue to get supervision around this myself, of not being the only person that can help this person. And now that it's available through remote, I don't want to get a buy into that model, because people can find help all over. But it's just some questions I have. And again, I think financially it will be helpful for both patients and the clinicians, particularly New York City rents. It's been pretty outrageous to figure out how to maintain a private practice in the city and, spend 20 to 30% of my income on rent. Has not been that fun. So I think that's where I'm at. Do I have one more slide? Yeah, some information. Just again, I sort of check in on these resources to understand like what's the new information, because I don't feel like there is one source. But I go to the New York State health page to understand, like, always checking in when the next expiration of the health regulations are going to be expiring. Sorry, that was a clunky way of saying, like, just making sure that I'm not doing anything illegal. I want to know when that next renewal is going to be, so I check in there. NASW has lots of resources about managing COVID-related things and getting you plugged into telehealth resources, and also the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association also has a lot of, you guys all know all this stuff, like the internet can be our friend. We just have to be careful, just finding like primary sources that feel the most reliable and most direct. Okay, I'm happy to hear any questions. I hope I'm not just totally preaching to the choir. I hope there were some things that felt useful and that you can take away from all of this, and looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts.
Thank you, Nicole. There was a couple of questions that came in over.
You can put a shirt on that.
Over the chat. One of them was early on by Tashima, and she asked, how did you get your internet service changed for no charge? Because everyone wants to charge a lot.
Interesting. I'm not the expert with Spectrum. That was my provider. It might have been that mine was so low. I think I was at like 5 megabits that they were sort of humorous with me. They were like, sure, like, of course we can double that for you. But maybe because I had opted for like the lowest and might have had some more room, and it might have been because it was in the beginning. and perhaps they were being more accommodating. I imagine there's, you know, a lot more like profiteering going on with all of this. I'm sure some of these companies got pretty smart about figuring out ways to charge people for these things. So that's all I can suggest is talking to the company to find out what resources they do have for people who may not be able to afford like a $20 a month increase or whatever they're asking for. And also if you're at the maximum of your own allotted plan that you're on. That's all I could say.
There was another question, Nicole, about have you considered using one of the Zoom backgrounds?
Yeah, happy to answer that. I have found that it's a little bit more grounding for my patients to see actually where I'm really at. Again, it's probably the clinical lens that I'm using. The virtual backgrounds, sometimes if you move in a particular way, you fade out. It can be a little disconcerting, particularly if you're working with somebody who might have like some reality testing difficulties. I don't want to be super pixelated. I don't want to fade away. And I kind of move a little bit.
I like to play with them sometimes and just like.
Pardon? Someone's responding?
No, I think that was a rather
okay.
interruption, but
Gotcha. But I do recommend you could try it. It's an apt comment because you should play around with some of those virtual backgrounds. It does provide some people tremendous relief, especially if they're in a tiny space, if they can't control their environment, if there may be somebody like scooting by in the background as they exit. That virtual background does provide, you know, a layer of boundary and protection and privacy. But for my, again, lucky that I have control over my space pretty much, so that really helps.
Thank you. Also, you had asked, or you had said that one of the things you were hoping for was to get a stand-up desk. So I would like to say that for anybody else who's interested in that, I got a stand-up desk that was quite affordable. I bought it, you know, from Amazon or whatever. But I will say to the point that you were making, Nicole, about moving, you know, from going from standing to sitting and, you know, moving around a little bit. It's one that you just prop up on your regular desk and then you can just make it disappear. Anybody who's interested in that, again, you know, feel free to be in touch with me and I will be happy to extend, you know, the names of the desks that I looked at. I do find that makes a total difference, actually. And so I'm not talking about doing telehealth, but even in teaching and in the amount of work that we do sitting around anyway. And also, you know, I just want to highlight some of the points that you made that to me were really enlightening. And, you know, just thank you again for sharing all of your wisdom and your experience. And by the way, sharing of yourself so much. So I think that that's one of the things also. So you are a teacher and teaching, in fact, or an educator, and educating is different, of course, than providing therapy. But you know, that's got to be a big leap, like professionally speaking, you know, that whole clean slate thing is now out the window. And it was interesting to me that you called your talk Maintaining the Frame. And then in fact, what you did was provide so many places where you're breaking the frame. So in terms of time, in terms of revealing stuff about yourself, in terms of showing about your space, in terms of inviting people into sessions, and telling people how to manage their partners, you know, just sort of randomly like that. Like just these things that I thought were really sort of remarkable. Also the business about credit cards. Do you ever explain why you don't want to use
Yes,
credit cards?
I do.
So,
I'm transparent about that.
Right. I mean, because these are political positions.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, like, in terms, if you could share with us a little bit personally, what the growth experience has been for you, not in any one area, but in this leap that you've had to make in terms of breaking that one sort of cardinal rule, which is to not reveal too much about yourself.
Right. Yes. I'm sure I'm still processing it because I do feel like I had to just show up that way, as well as sometimes I just couldn't control the environment. I had to, because it happened so suddenly. It's not like I wouldn't even have known about virtual backgrounds, you know, until whatever 2 or 3 weeks into the pandemic. I just think just jumping into it just had to break open some of those more, you know, I'm psychodynamically trained. I do follow some of that. I've always been a little bit looser than being like a complete blank slate. But I think it's really enhanced the work. I don't know how it will go going forward. I do wonder if people are going to wish for a little bit more boundary and not knowing some of the things that they're knowing about me in this way. I'm open to continuing to discuss it and talk about it, because I think it was, people were hungry for it at certain times, and maybe now there's a little bit more a sense of, okay, I think I understand what we're dealing with right now, as opposed to like all of that like real crisis uncertainty in the beginning. But I mean, I think the other thing too is it's not just the pandemic. Obviously, I do think November is bringing up a lot of anxiety with the election, and I think people just need me to be different than a person who doesn't disclose some things about myself. In this, if I'm going to be more relational this way, I just have to keep checking in. Like, how does this feel? Like, this about me. I think just being in Vermont says something about me. It's a huge reveal to be in the state of Vermont, which just people have all sorts of associations with, and think about all sorts of different, very opposing politics. Actually, we have quite the disparity here of pretty conservative folks, and then Bernie Sanders people. But I have personally found it more connected in the work since we are remote like this, and I would never really want to be staring at a screen all day. To have more of my personal self, because we are in this very impersonal modality, I think has been wonderful, and I've appreciated it. And I think most of my patients appreciate it in that I can see the humor. There's a little bit of an ease between us that feels nice and necessary. But I do imagine there are some people who are not loving it. And I'm going to have to sort of rework that at some point when they can bring it up. If I poke them enough and they can finally say like, oh, I really, I didn't like, you sharing that with me. That was really wrecked everything for me. So I'm open to exploring it.
I think the idea that you brought up also, I mean, you had so many great points. And by the way, the chat is saying, oh, I don't know, you can't look at it, don't look at it, but you're getting a lot of positive feedback.
Yes.
But anyway, one thing I think that was really interesting that you mentioned, and it's not irrelevant at this point in the workshop, is the idea of terminations and how to manage terminations.
Yeah.
Because you said, oh, you wrecked everything for me. But if I was online with a therapist and I felt that person had wrecked everything for me, I would probably just like press delete and that would be that. But maybe that's more revealing about me than I should have estimated. But yeah, just like, where do you draw the line anymore? And then I have one other point, but I don't want to take up all the chat. So
there's a question that just came through.
Okay.
Sarah asked, do you have techniques for protecting yourself emotionally when clients say things that are triggering around our shared pandemic experiences?
Do I have ways of protecting myself? I'm trying to think of something, to be honest, and I've been doing this for a really long time, and this is not something I'm recommending, but there tends to be a little bit of a numbness after a while when you hear a lot of trauma. So it takes a lot for something to get in, and again, that's why I think it's really important to have colleagues to share stuff with, because we know we can act like we just have all this armor all the time and like it's not impacting us, but it is. The one thing that I think I'm struggling with sometimes are some people who, in my opinion, have gone way too far into the self-protection mode, have not left I knew people who didn't leave their house for 3 solid months. They didn't go outside once. And just, that was more upsetting to me, that I was like, oh my gosh, and they were so certain that that was the smartest and the best thing to do, was to never leave their house, have everything delivered, wipe everything down, and in a way that to me felt like extreme, particularly after the first couple of months went by when we started hearing more information about, how you could contract it. But they really held on to that worldview, and I saw it turning into a way to be very angry and upset with everybody else who wasn't social distancing, who wasn't wearing masks all the time. All those people were putting them at risk. And then I just realized this is the clinical work. This would have come up in another way outside of COVID, that sense of I'm doing everything right and everyone else is doing everything wrong. And that's that's a characterological and a personality dynamic that is probably very painful for them. But my initial reaction was always like, I want you to go outside. Like, I want you to wear a mask and gloves and go take a walk in the park because you need some air. But they were not ready for that. So that's maybe one example I would think of where I felt like just that disconnect and wondering how I was going to help this person when I felt like I'm seeing things so differently. But we muddled through. I don't know if that answered your question.
There's another one that came up that said, I wonder if you can draw some parallels. I mean, I know you have a lot of agency practice as well in the hospital setting and so forth. And you probably have a lot of colleagues that you're in touch with who are in agency practices. Do you know of any similarities or differences between providing the kind of services that you do in your private practice and services, in an agency?
Again, I think it really depends on the agencies. There are some agencies where the workers still had to come in. And obviously that's a very different dynamic, having had to be a frontline worker and getting, possibly being exposed every day and navigating all of that. Most of my colleagues either got to work remotely, even the agencies at the agency settings, all got to work remotely. The only people I think that I was friends with were doctors who had to go back and go into hospitals and work in that front. I can't imagine. I mean, I really think that we're going to be seeing like some PTSD dynamics related to that time for the frontline workers and people who had to be in figuring out how to navigate that in the early days when there was so little information and there was so much chaos. And I do think we're going to see a lot more PTSD, again, probably after January, when some things maybe have gotten figured out and then people can start feeling things, because a lot of those frontline workers are still frontline workers and they're not able to process that stuff until there's a rest. So I think we're going to see a lot of anxiety and depression in a different way. It's maybe not as heightened, but it like feels a little bit more deep, probably in the spring.
There was another question that came in from Carmen, and she was asking, what challenges have you encountered with older patients in regards to telehealth, and how have you been able to engage them?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, in my practice, I don't have that many people like over 65. And even that, I might only have like one or two. And I have to say that they are pretty tech savvy, but I do really worry about all the people that we're missing, who don't have access, who don't understand the technology and can't adapt to the remote work. And this is a huge role for social workers. I think of helping people, honestly, like census workers and poll workers, and like we're going to have to really be much more proactive, helping people set these systems up and figuring out really simple. I mean, if somebody wants to, have a $1 billion business, you should figure out like a one button video conferencing system for folks who don't have the bandwidth to figure out all of this technology, because we have an aging population, obviously, Justine can speak to this more, who are not going to be able to keep up with the complicated, like, even this is challenging for me. And, it's just going to get more and more complicated, and we're going to need it more and more, rely on it more and more. I also think about hearing issues too. How are we going to make sure that all of these devices have closed caption, are on top of being able to be available to anybody with any type of ability. So making sure that the companies are providing that as well.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. Does anyone have any other questions?
I would be happy to ask a question if to the audience, if they're interested. Any of these were things that I was thinking about, like just curious about what are some of your own challenges that you've had to figure out, whether it's around confidentiality or your own self-care.
I would say something.
Mm-hmm.
I think meeting with them for the first time, I think I'm just having trouble with like just having sessions over like a camera because I don't know, like you mentioned before, like you have to worry about like the background and like other things that they're dealing with and stuff. So I think one of the challenges for me is just having that first session with them.
Mm-hmm.
And making sure like, you know, they're comfortable in a safe space, etc.
That they're comfortable and in a safe space.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But do you feel like you're comfortable? Like if you were able to do it, do you know that your environment feels safe and comfortable?
Yes. I mean, besides like the outside noise and like things that, you know, I can't control, other than that, like I'm comfortable. I'm used to, you know, using Zoom, but depending on the age group I'll be working with, would determine how comfortable they are, like talking when family's around or just finding a quiet space and, you know, things that they might be dealing with while meeting with me.
Yeah. Again, I think it's good to have a set of introduction questions like, where are you? Do you have a quiet space? Who else is home with you? Just helping them identify what the possible interruptions could be. So it's not a surprise. And you might be able to help them problem solve. You know, oh, your brother's doing his homework too. Can you throw on some headphones? Or do you want to bring your brother into this session because, you know, maybe he can help us understand I'm not sure like what the presenting issues are, but maybe this would be an opportunity since he happens to be right here and has nowhere else to go. Does he want to weigh in on how things are going in the family? Does he have some thoughts about like why you're feeling anxious or depressed? To be able to have that flexibility instead of feeling like, you know, another conference topic could be our quest for confidentiality. I think this is, you know, maybe we've been preserving something that feels so precious, like having like private space to be able to share our deepest, darkest thoughts. I don't think that's going to be possible for a lot of people. And we might need to understand, like, is there something different besides confidentiality in the way we work with people that we can elicit support and get some information that doesn't have to feel so, so private.
So would that be something, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was just gonna ask, is that something that we should be asking them each time we meet with them? Like, who are you around? Are you in the, you know, stuff like that?
I wouldn't, especially if it's a teenager or a young person, or, I mean, even my adults, they forget. They're like, oh, I'm totally alone. And then all of a sudden, like, somebody opens the door. And they're like, oh yeah, but my house cleaner's here. I'm like, okay, you're not totally alone. So I think it is helpful just to sort of say that you want to make the best use of the session. And so by just asking a couple of these questions and confirming with them, it sets the frame, and then hopefully that becomes a little bit of muscle memory for them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There was a comment that Carla shared. She said one of the challenges for her is to engage an almost nonverbal autistic child, and that she's using video social stories, but getting responses from him is quite limited.
Yeah. 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 I think sometimes like we have to be able to feel like this is my psychodynamic side coming out, but we have to trust that our attention and energy being directed at this person is doing something, even if we don't get a verbal confirmation of that, right? If this person is showing up for this activity, they're doing something online, they come back the next week, that's information. Even if they can't say like, I'm benefiting from this, or I am, you know, this makes sense to me. We often don't get a lot of verbal confirmation. So we just have to know that if they show up the next week, or if they participated in the activity, something's happening. But it's just a little elusive, unconscious. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess the other thing to think about too, going back to like my colleagues who work with children, it may be also interesting to introduce other family members to the session, to have an activity with this young person, to also see if there's a different way of engagement.
Yeah, it seems like one of the things that you've really highlighted is that, in fact, there are a lot of opportunities as well as challenges. And, you know, I think that's been really helpful. And I also like how you position social workers as basically, you know, prepared for this. You know,
Yes.
This is what we do. We do problem solve. We do live in these uncertain gray areas. You know, we adopt the position of not knowing. And now we have to really, it's not just a one-on-one thing anymore. Now it's really just more, you know, existential. So I think that's a nice takeaway as well. And somebody did mention that, you know, privacy or confident, you know, having the space to be private and confidential is in fact a privilege.
Absolutely.
So not everybody's going to have that, and that's something to contend with. And it highlight. I think that this shift has highlighted a lot of the, you know, obviously the moment has highlighted a lot of inequities, but even in the practice. And you made a point about rural versus, you know, how telehealth has in fact brought to some populations has brought more equity because there are, you know, so many underserved populations, you know, for any number of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, you know, if you had to go into an office and you had to travel very far to get to the office, that wasn't going to happen. And so telehealth has filled some of those voids. I thought that was a really interesting point as well. I'm just going to take a look at the chat now.
It also makes me think a little bit about, you know, sometimes people want to work with a person of color, or they want to work with somebody who speaks Cantonese, and they can't find that in their state, in their environment, in their community. And telehealth will totally blow that open, where people could actually find somebody who speaks their language. I mean, we have been asking people to adapt, like we're asking our patients and consumers to adapt to what's available in ways that I think have not been doing them much of a service. And I think confidentiality is another dynamic of that. When we're desperately trying to find them private spaces instead of like joining them in their community space, and acknowledging this is their reality, and we can still do good work. We just have to change our expectations and what we've been taught.
Mm-hmm. Carmen has her hand raised. Carmen, you want to ask your question?
Oh, no, maybe we kept her waiting too long.
Oh dear.
But there was another question. Are there general ways you've noticed that are different in your engagement and interviewing process now working remotely?
My engagement or interviewing process. I know. I don't think so. Maybe just being more direct about rules and things. You know, a couple came to see me maybe 6 weeks ago. We only had like maybe 4 sessions, but the woman would always like bring her dinner to the meeting. You know, like just things like that were so surprising to me. I was like, wow, I've never had somebody actually bring a plate of food to the session, and had to figure out, or bring wine. She's having a glass of wine. And then having to be like, what, do I need to correct this? Is this just information that I should be taking into account? Like, you know, she doesn't necessarily have a sense of the boundaries. So those are some of the difficult dynamics, but I'm trying to think, like, people kind of still reveal themselves almost in the same ways. People are still late to session via Zoom as they are in my office. Or people are right on time. Like the people who, you know, knock on my door at exactly 7:01, you know, are knocking on my Zoom wall at 7:01.
Can I just, oh, I'm sorry, because no, that's all right. I had asked that question actually, and I guess what I was thinking is because you don't have body language, you're only, you know, you're staring at the person's face. I guess one of the things I was thinking, do you find that you're giving more comments or maybe checking in more, saying, okay, your face, you said one thing, but your face seems to be saying something else, but you don't have any other body language, for example. Are they fidgeting? Are they, you know, you don't have all of that other information. So I guess that's what I was thinking when I asked the question. So do you
Yes.
find that you're having to comment more, or because it is so intense, it's face to face,
Right.
that, you know?
Yes. Yeah. It's funny. I really appreciate, I have a few people who prefer phone versus video. And what that has reminded me of is that I have to listen very differently on the phone. You're listening for pauses. You're listening for hesitation. When are they speeding up? When are they slowing down? And so we're just, again, our bodies are pretty amazing how we adapt. I just switch into a different gear and I'm hearing different things that signal that I need to question something, or I need to say like, oh, wait a minute, you just stopped for a second, there's something going on. When they're in the office, maybe I'll see a toe tap, or maybe I'll see, you know, them picking at their fingernails,
Right.
that kind of thing. But I just think you start getting attuned to different things that signal to you that there's something going on. On the flip side, I do have to say I have a few people. I have two patients who have like very significant skin picking conditions, and it's obsessive skin picking. And on the flip side, sometimes I wish I didn't have to be so up close and seeing their level of distress tolerance, because they are literally just like, you know, shredding their face in front of me at a very close range. Whereas in the office, it was much easier to tolerate because, you know, they're 6 feet away and I could look at their feet sometimes or look at other parts of their body, because it's very distressing to be seeing somebody doing that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there can be the flip side of seeing things.
Yeah,
Not
those
seeing
two ways.
things. Yes, exactly.
There was a related question, which was from Shannon. Are there any other additional questions that you think should be included in the intake or assessment process to maybe fill some of the gaps, or, you know, what you said?
I think we're probably more interested in isolation questions. How isolated are you? Who do you connect with? Do you know your neighbors? And I'm a little bit more proactive, particularly when people are feeling super isolated, to get them to check in on their own neighbors, especially the young people, just saying like, you know, they're so anxious and they're so distraught because, you know, their education has been so interrupted and their jobs have been so interrupted. And, you know, one of the coping mechanisms I have is like, well, you need to be taking care of somebody else, because I know there's somebody in your building who needs their dog walked or who needs food delivery. So part of the engagement process is a little bit more like, what are your coping mechanisms and how are you helping other people? And also just how isolated are you and who do you use for all of these different ways of connecting, particularly when you can't see people that you love and care about. So I think those two things might be different. And maybe, as I said, I've just tightened up my protocols a little bit. I'm just better at gathering information. I'm writing things down better. I'm writing down doctors' information and just tightening up my game. This feels like a responsibility.
So there's like 5 minutes left. So if anybody has a final thought, or if Nicole, you have a final thought, personally, I want to thank you. You know, I think you did a really enlightening workshop. And I'm not at all surprised, because 15 years ago I knew. But I want to thank you. And if I hand it back to you know, Amanda and Jessica, who are our leaders in these workshops. But thank you so much. Oh, there she is. There's Amanda, our fearless leader.
This is great. Thank you. We really appreciate this. And I just want to remind everyone to complete your CEU evaluation form. Usually I'm running around asking you to fill it out and give it back to me, but now I'm asking you to click the link that I just put in the chat, and that will take you to a Google form where you fill your information in and your email will get sent, and we will send your CEU that way.
Thank you all. I really appreciate that you spent the afternoon with me on a gray Thursday. It's gray in my town. Thanks for all the feedback and questions. And yeah, just really trust that you all have the skills, you have the drive, you have the curiosity to be some of the people who make this moment like a transformational moment going forward. We are going to change some of like our lamest practices in this moment. And in a couple of years, we're going to have done some really, really good transformational work, getting to more people, especially in rural areas, poorer people, demanding internet connectivity for everyone. And we're going to be part of that. So I'm happy to have you all as my colleagues.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you again. And thank you to everyone who was here. We had a great group, and I appreciate everyone interacting and asking great questions. Nicole, thank you for your thoughtful answers and your thoughtful presentation. I think it was really helpful for people. All right, everyone. So please scroll up to find the evaluation, and we will send it out via email again in case anyone's missing it. I hope everybody has a great evening, and we'll see you again in October.
Great, thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hey, Carol. Okay. I liked it a lot.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very informative. Thank you.